Hi, everybody. I'm so happy for us to be together again. You know that. We have such a splendid guest today. Now, I'd heard so many things about Patrick Treacy. Today, we want to do something a little bit more. We want to get to know Patrick. We want to get a chance to know who he is and why. It like growing up for you?
I must say that the period growing up in Northern Ireland was both interesting and quite difficult. When we went to school originally, we were given an awful amount of freedom in terms of allowing to use our own intuition and to use our own ability. And I suppose I particularly excelled at science. So by the time I was 15, I'd won the British Amateur Young Scientist of the Year competition. And when I was 1 year later, I won the Aer Lingus Biochemist of the Year. This had brought me, I suppose, different places in my life, and I met Harold Wilson, the sort of Prime Minister at the time, and also I was one of the first people that discovered that sounds in some way could influence plants. Brings me into an interesting story regarding Michael Jackson, because I suppose when I was young, we had a lot of freedom to do what we wanted, but we had the British education system, which was very fair. Looking back on some of the original experimentation and things we'd done, I had unwittingly almost discovered the CD player when I was about 15. It was like a radio playing in one room, and the radio waves being modulated by just the sound itself, mirrors, the photoelectric cells, and we didn't realize what we were doing. We were probably ahead of our time. The sort of things you couldn't do in this day and age, because things are much more conformist and everybody has to do their own thing. But you can imagine a 15-year-old with a total physics lab to play with. The story I will talk about regarding Michael was that one of the experiments that I had done at the time was that I had taken an audio frequency oscillator, and for those that are listening that don't know what that is just a machine that creates sound waves of a certain wavelength. And you can change the wavelength and it'll go from almost like somebody singing, and I discovered at a certain wavelength that a plant called mung bean grew much higher. And at the time, we didn't have that much money growing up, and I required, believe it or not, a certain thing called acoustic wadding. That means that the sound wouldn't escape, or that no sound could come into where the experiment was. And my father, who was a great man, absolutely wonderful man, and he got into this, and because he knew I needed this particular type of wood, he went outside our garage and he cut down the main sort of sign advertising sort of our business that we were growing up. And when I woke up in the morning, we had 2 different experimental boxes, all made for me with the speakers in them and everything. And I went forward and I sort of won that. And I was chatting to Michael in the house one night about this, and he was absolutely fascinated. And he turned around and he says, you know, I've always known that sort of sound can influence plants. And I said, Patrick, how do you think that worked? And Michael would have that cheeky sort of grin in his face that I knew he wanted me to say, oh, the plants love sound, and when they had a certain sound, they grew higher. And I was sort of just messing with him, and I said, well, you know, had I known you at the time, and had I known Heal the World, I would have played that through the speakers. And he was laughing at that, and he says, well, how do you think it worked? And I knew he wanted me to say it because the plants loved and cherished sound. But instead I turned around because one of the theories of how it worked was possibly that the sound at a certain wavelength was vibrating the soil, and it was releasing these things called negative growth inhibitors. And one of them is in ethylene gas. And just to wind Michael up, I said to him, I think how it worked was, you know, this particular sound shook the soil, and as a consequence of that, it released negative inhibitors, and the plants grew. It's simple as that, just a scientific thing. And he looked at me sort of all disappointed with that boyish sort of look on his face and says, he's saying, Tracy, I don't know whether you're trying to wind me up here or not. But he just turned around and said, oh, well, if that's the case, you know, what we should have done was play Billie Jean right up high, you know, and let them rock all the soil at once, you know. Yeah.
That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. I know that we titled your show "The Road Not Taken."
Yes.
And me, I must let you know, I love I love poetry. In fact, my aunt was like the poet laureate for Illinois. And so I love it, and I grew up with poetry. Now, the poem that had a great effect upon my life was If by Rudyard Kipling.
Yes.
And so you have The Road Not Taken. Did you commit it to memory?
The Road Not Taken is a very interesting poem. We know it's by Frost. It was written in 1916, and in some ways it's a very sort of iconic poem, and it certainly is built around that penultimate line, I took the one less travelled by. The poem starts off, the first couple of verses of it are, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveller long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could. To where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the best claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Now this is an interesting line, because there's no doubt about it, adventure in life or otherwise is a step down an overgrown path. And I suppose the step that sort of he's talking about, he's saying sort of, he who never walks save where he sees men's tracks makes sort of no discoveries. You know, and you almost have to push aside the tangled adventure beyond the sort of mainstream, but there's no doubt about it. The last two lines, I took the one less travelled by, and that has made the difference. And in some ways, there's no doubt about it, we use this in terms of our own rationalising our decisions, be them with pride or regret, and there's no doubt about it. I suppose in some ways the poem is a panning into individualism and non-conformism. And to a lot of, I suppose, my time growing up, I suppose in some ways I was a courageous non-reformist, and that sort of got me into a lot of interesting scenarios, be it Iran during the period of the Ayatollah Khomeini, be it in Kurdistan during the period of the Iran-Iraq War, where I sort of eventually became a prisoner under Saddam Hussein, be it to the Berlin when the wall came down, and many other interesting places and beyond. So there's no doubt about it. I suppose it is an apt title for the show we're having tonight for the interview.
But I want to hear more about Iran and Iraq.
Okay.
Okay, so talk to us about that.
Sure. Well, I suppose